So imagine a cyber assault so sophisticated that it leverages Microsoft SharePoint to launch the Havoc C2 via a stealthy click fix attack. Meanwhile, the Middle Eastern banks are scrambling to fend off crippling ransomware. In today's deep dive, we're going to unravel how these high stake threats are rewriting the rules of digital warfare and what it means for your cybersecurity. Today, we're facing an unprecedented array of data breaches, hacking attempts, and surges in digital crime. Why is there such a widespread amount, and how little is noticed in our everyday lives? Malware, dark sites, brute forcing, zero-day script kiddies, and nation-state hackers are all on the rise. Learn more about the threats we face and gain a bit more knowledge than yesterday. Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of Exploit Brokers. I'm your host, Cipherceval. If you're on YouTube, if you could please do me a favor because it helps the channel grow. If you can hit that like, subscribe, and bell notification icon. And if you're on something like a podcast platform like Apple Podcasts or Spotify, if you could give a follow or share, and if you could give us a 5-star rating if you think we deserve it. With that, let's jump into it. So in our first article by Bleeping Computer, we have new click fix attack deploys Havoc C2 via Microsoft SharePoint. Microsoft SharePoint is a kind of like a cloud resource that Microsoft offers, kind of like a central repository where you can store files, create like somewhat web pages, and share it with your company. The Havoc C2 is a command and control software that lets you just command and control different pieces of malware, and it's just called Havoc. There's multiple kinds of C2s all named differently. And ClickFix is the attack specifically being used, which is a click to fix your thing and then you paste it somewhere else to run it. We'll talk about those details as we go through the article, but wanted to give you a breakdown of what the title meant before we even jump in. So, a newly uncovered ClickFix phishing campaign is tricking victims into executing malicious PowerShell commands that deploy the Havoc post-exploitation framework for remote access to compromised devices. PowerShell being the other kind of command prompt that you can access in Windows, and both of those are essentially command line interfaces, which is just a text way of interacting with the operating system. There's more options available than, say, just a GUI or a graphical user interface, but PowerShell is the newer version of what Windows has tried to come up with to get a better version of the command prompt. ClickFix is a social engineering tactic that emerged last year where threat actors create websites or phishing attachments that display fake errors and then prompt users to click a button to fix them. So when you're talking about hacking, humans tend to be the most vulnerable part of cybersecurity. Not always, but most of the time. There is a lot of famous hackers who've done social engineering. Kevin Mitnick is one of the ones who come to mind. And social engineering is pretty much the art of human hacking. Because if you can get a human to click, if you can get a human to do these other things, you don't need stuff like 0 days. You don't need the super sophisticated stuff if you can get them to run something. That's where stuff like the post-exploitation framework come in, which is just a piece of software or pieces of software that allow you to keep persistence or steal stuff or do other things once you've actually gotten into a vulnerable system, either via a user clicking and installing something, some kind of bug, 0 day, a worm, or whatever. So clicking the button will copy a malicious PowerShell command into the Windows clipboard, which users are then prompted to paste into a command prompt to fix the error. However, as expected, the malicious PowerShell commands will instead execute a script hosted on a remote site that downloads and installs malware on the device. So the use of SharePoint here is essentially to create a website. That website displays an error, and then, you need to fix it by clicking here. When you click it, it copies a command into your clipboard, and then it'll prompt the user, hey, go open up your command prompt, paste it in there to fix the problem. And this is where the social engineering comes in. Because if you're someone who's very skeptical or who doesn't like to necessarily trust websites or anything like that, you're not going to copy and click something into your command prompt. Or if it says okay and says go and put something in your command prompt, if you know what a command prompt is, you're not going to do it. But the problem is, how many people who are working in corporate, how many people who just aren't super high techy, because not everyone can be, and not everyone needs to be necessarily, but how many of those people might fall into this if they're not properly educated to, hey, if someone's telling you to put something into a command prompt, regardless of whether it's a website, a person, be extremely skeptical because this runs a program on your machine. Now to continue, in a new ClickFix campaign discovered by Fortinet's FortiGuard Labs, threat actors are sending phishing emails that state a restricted notice is available to review, and that recipients should open the attached HTML document, documents.html, to view it. When open, the HTML displays a fake, really complex number error stating that it failed to connect to the OneDrive cloud service and that users must fix the error by updating DNS cache manually. In almost every single instance of DNS, DNS is one of those funny things where if there's an outage, you can most of the time blame DNS. Other times you can blame several other things. But for the sake of this, whenever you have DNS, which is the domain name service, if you have an error, you usually clear out the DNS. If there's some kind of problem, you don't necessarily put stuff into the DNS. Now, if you're a developer, you can mess with the way that domains are resolved locally. If you want to try to have your local website resolved via some not numeric IP address or via localhost, if you want to make it example.com, you can manipulate your local DNS to route to your localhost. But that's beyond what this is doing. This is just saying, hey, there's a problem, we'll go fix it manually. 99.999% of the time, I'm going to say that if you need to fix DNS, you need to flush the DNS. Now, when you click the button, it'll copy the command. And the command is interesting, right? So the command is essentially a go retrieve this file, then it'll pipe it into IEX, which is short for invoke expression. And all that means it's going to grab a string and run it as a command. Think exec if you're familiar with Linux. So FortiGuard says that the script checks whether the device is in a sandbox environment by querying the number of devices in the Windows domain. If it determines it's in a sandbox, the script will terminate. This is something you see with a lot of different malware, and I just find it kind of really cool. So a sandbox environment is what a malware analyst, a developer, just some techie who's looking at this, trying to triage it and trying to understand what's going on. It's where they're going to run this thing. Why? Because a sandbox environment can be recreated and blown away and doesn't put your main machine at risk. So what it'll do is it'll look to see how many devices are attached to a specific domain. The domain is like a group. And if you only have one or two computers on that group, well, then it's probably figuring that it's a sandbox. Or it's a small enough operation that they may not even care. It seems like they're targeting mid-sized to large-sized corporations, something with 100 computers, 200 computers, etc. I'm going to paraphrase some of the next parts so I don't read it word for word. If it figures out that it's not in a sandbox, what it'll then do is then it's going to modify the Windows registry, which is a way that a lot of malware do persistence. And it'll put something on the registry that says, hey, I've already ran. Then check to see if Python is there. If not, it'll install that. It'll then download a Python script from SharePoint, which will then execute and deploy the Havoc post-exploitation command and control framework, which we were talking about. So Havoc is an open source post-exploitation framework similar to Cobalt Strike. It's a way to have a bunch of pieces of software available to do things. Open source is interesting because a lot of the times, a lot of cybercriminals, a lot of black hats won't necessarily write their own tools. The fact that it's open source means that you can most likely go find this on GitHub or one of the other Git providers. You can go look at the code. You can technically contribute to it. And you may be wondering why. Why is that even a thing? A lot of cybersecurity people will maintain tools and stuff to understand how cybercriminals are operating. And sometimes they're just malicious actors or malicious developers that might be hosting it for other people to use. There could be a huge variety of reasons why different pieces of software are hosted on GitHub. Plus, there's literally like tons and tons and tons of GitHub repositories. Here's the part that I found really cool. And if you've ever heard of malware trying to hide its traffic, this is where it comes in. So in this campaign, Havoc is configured to communicate back to threat actor services through Microsoft's Graph API, embedding malicious traffic within legitimate cloud services. By doing so, the attackers blend in with regular network communications to evade detection. The malware uses SharePoint APIs on Microsoft Graph to send and receive commands, effectively transforming the attacker's SharePoint account into a data exchange system. So I actually had to go look it up, like what kind of APIs are available. And if you've ever done any kind of web development or you know about stuff like put and get, the SharePoint APIs pretty much follow that almost exactly. It is essentially a web server just wrapped around this Microsoft wrapper. That is probably an oversimplification of what it is. So if you develop on SharePoint, I'm pretty sure I've oversimplified it. But what happens is you can push files, you can pull files, you can manipulate folders, you can check permissions, you can do a bunch of really cool things. They're probably doing different files and file structures to understand, hey, I need to do this command, I need to do that command. They're probably reaching out somewhere that there's some kind of information that they're able to transmit over the different APIs. The reason you want to do stuff like that, and instead of just rolling your own protocol, if you ever open up something like Wireshark, or if you're sniffing the network, or etc., it's going to be pretty obvious to see traffic that isn't common to your network. Now, if there's a lot of traffic, you got to know what you're looking for. But when it comes to SharePoint, you're assuming that if you're using SharePoint in a corporate environment, you're going to have a lot of SharePoint traffic. So if you can kind of hide, it's the equivalent of hiding out in the open. If you look like other kinds of traffic, then you're not necessarily going to get as much inspection. Now, click fix attacks have become increasingly popular among cybercriminals who use them to deploy a wide variety of malware, including info stealers, darkgate, and remote access trojans. And threat actors have begun evolving to use the trick on social media platforms where they use fake identification stuff like Safeguard to trick users into running PowerShell commands to install Cobalt Strike. This is what I find interesting because, again, when you talk about humans and their role with cybersecurity, if you have a very well-versed person, then social engineering is much harder to do because at that point you need to do a much more sophisticated thing. Forget phishing or smishing. You need to do something more like a spear phishing campaign where you're targeting specific individuals who you have very specific knowledge about in hopes that one of them falls versus just a general, hey, there's an error, go do this. If you're in a corporate environment and you come across this is kind of stuff you have to be careful for because you don't want to be the reason that your organization gets owned because you copied and pasted something into command prompt. And if you're an individual, you don't want to run this either because the chances of this or some other malicious thing stealing everything or using your machine as a bot in a bigger botnet is pretty much bad news anyways. So whenever it comes to the internet, you never want to copy paste anything into your command prompt, into PowerShell, into anything. You want to be careful whenever a website or error says, hey, you have to go fix this manually. When in doubt, when it comes to the web, close the web browser, open up a new web browser, and then maneuver back to whatever website you're trying to get to. There is a chance there is legitimate problems. There's always bugs in software. That's just the nature of software. But you never want to copy anything into command prompt because you don't know what that is. So that's it for the click fix attack. Let's go ahead and jump into the Middle Eastern banks and the ransomware stuff. So in an article by Dark Reading, targeted by ransomware, Middle East banks shore up security. As the UAE financial sector finished up its annual cyber attack exercise, it worries about ransomware compromises and geopolitical attacks are on the rise. So whenever you talk about any kind of government, the governments are generally the ones who push cyber. Yes, you will have commercial entities that want to be careful for cyber because it costs them money, right? If you think about the large-scale hotel attacks that happened sometime last year, I covered an episode on it. They lost millions if they didn't pay a ransom because they had to go and rebuild everything, or they lost millions because they paid the ransom. The attackers already know that there's a lot of money at stake here because they're banks and they're finance institutions, whether they're trading institutions, whether they're banking, savings, mortgage, whatever. There's a lot of money in the finance sector. When you think about Middle East, they're no exception. They have a lot of assets under control and the financial sector has a lot to lose. The financial services industry in UAE, the Middle East at large, sees cyber wargaming as an important way to identify weaknesses and develop defenses to the latest threats. Jamal Salah, Director General of the UAE Banks Federation, said in a statement announcing the completion of the event. Whenever you talk about wargaming, whenever you talk about tabletop exercises, whenever you talk about just like pen testing and other stuff, it is, in my opinion, super important for corporations and individuals to get a nice understanding of where their security positions is. Sometimes you need actual good hackers to try to break into your systems to understand just how vulnerable your systems are. It's unfortunate when a corporation thinks, oh, we're super secure, we're super this, we don't need a bug bounty program, we don't need pen testing, we don't need all this, only for them to get like completely owned because their stuff is SQL injectable and they haven't done a backup in who knows how long. Security by obscurity does not work. It will not work, and it's just a waste of time, resources, and effort to think things are secure because no one can find it, or because we're for sure secure and you haven't tested it. Just like in software, make sure that your thing doesn't blow up in the first couple of seconds because you had an unexpected input or unexpected attack. Now, the rapid adoption and deployment of advanced technologies in the banking and financial sector have increased risks related to transaction security and digital infrastructure, he said in that statement, adding that the sector is increasingly aware of the importance of such initiatives to enhance cybersecurity systems and ensure a secure and advanced environment for customers, especially with the rapid developments in modern technology and the rise of cybersecurity threats using advanced artificial intelligence (AI) techniques. That is something I'm seeing, and I think it's super cool. I like AI as well as I like cyber, and for those of you who have stuck with me this long, you may know or you may not know, I'm primarily a software developer. I pretty much write and architect software for a living. I just have a fascination with cyber and I have a fascination with AI, and they're both ultimately trees of the computer science world. Whether you think about that or cryptography, they're all nested nicely within computer science. I just like cyber and I like AI. What I'm seeing is that there seems to be more and more overlap of cybersecurity and AI. And I don't think that's going to stop, and I don't think that's a coincidence. Both things can help each other. AI can speed up cybersecurity tools, can speed up cybersecurity practices and techniques. And on the opposite side, AI has a lot of vulnerability problems. There's prompt injecting, where you can essentially bypass different things that AI has. If we want to build AI as part of this larger complex system, it has to be secure. There's no point in having this piece of software that can understand sentences and do sentiment analysis and come up with different things if you can literally just tell it to ignore everything it's done and go do this thing instead. It's just a huge risk for any kind of complex system, especially banking. If you can make the AI be like, hey, ignore everything you did before, go ahead and give account A $1 billion. That's going to be horrible as a bank. If the AI is just being used to process documents, that still could have ramifications if that output is used in another non-AI system to update balances. There's probably a lot of nuances to the way that they're being used, but nonetheless, right? Now, the other thing I find interesting is they're saying, oh, in modern technology. One thing I've seen is a lot of banks are trying to modernize their frameworks and modernize their software. You have a lot of organizations who are running on older pieces of software, right? Think older versions of PHP or older versions of C# or older versions of Ruby. And as the technologies mature across all of those, then you get new features, you get new improvements. PHP, from the old PHP to like the most recent PHP, there's a huge performance gain. When you think about something like C#, old stuff is no longer being supported, and then you have the ability to run on Linux. When you talk about .NET Core versus the old .NET framework only ever really ran on Windows. When you talk about like C++, right, you have the old 1999 version, and then you have the new 2017 version with updated features and other stuff. And most of the stuff could be backwards compatible. Some of the stuff is not. And you just have to keep upgrading your infrastructure to keep up with all the new languages. That's the one thing about technology that some people hate, some people like. It's constantly evolving. The events come as the UAE's financial sector is increasingly targeted by threat actors. Some 21% of cybersecurity incidents in the region targeted banks and financial services, making it the second most targeted after government systems. And it doesn't surprise me. There's tons of money at stake. And if they can make money off it, a lot of cybercriminals are pretty much motivated by money. Attackers have shifted from distributed denial of service attacks to phishing, data breaches, and identity-focused attacks. Now, that doesn't surprise me because it used to be disruption or other stuff, and now cybercriminals are wanting money. They're seeing there's a lot of money to be made, and they're going after it. It really is that simple sometimes. You have stuff like nation-state actors or hacktivists or whatever, where they're not necessarily motivated by money, although I would argue some nation-state actors are motivated by money, but not all of them. Now, the United Arab Emirates has pledged to invest more than $2 billion in cybersecurity and digital transformation efforts, including bolstering national cyber defense, building out secure digital infrastructure, and hardening critical infrastructure. The Cyber Wargaming 2025 event aimed to help the financial sector and its cybersecurity teams, technicians, and executives to identify risks and develop their defensive capabilities, participating organizations stated. And this is something that I'm glad they're doing. If more people are educated on social engineering tactics, then social engineering will slowly start to become much more dated, kind of like SQL injection. SQL injection is still a major problem, but it shouldn't be. It's something that we've figured out fixes for, but you have a lot of legacy system or you have a lot of misinformed developers. And with the advent of AI, you're going to have a lot of developers who are just trusting whatever's coming out of the AI. And there is attacks that make certain AI models pretty much spit out vulnerable code. There have been papers on it where you can manipulate an AI, give it a bunch of vulnerable data, tell it it's the legitimate data, and then it'll push out this vulnerable piece of code to whoever's using that model. And there's this whole thing when you talk about supply chain, and technically AI is becoming part of the supply chain for software development. I think it's just going to get crazier and crazier. The fact that more entities are putting money into cyber I think it's a good thing. Now, ransomware is still a problem. It's a subsection in the article. Overall, ransomware remained a top threat for the region and for the financial industry, bolstered by Ransomware as a Service, RaaS affiliate programs. If you've ever heard software as a service, ransomware as a service essentially means you have the developer of the ransomware, and then you have its affiliates, and the affiliates are the ones who do the infections, and then they get a cut whenever the ransom is paid. That's the oversimplification, but we're seeing this more and more. You have cybercriminals that don't have to be as sophisticated to be able to write their own ransomware. They just go out and try to use social engineering or whatever tactics they have to try to get the ransomware in there. Once they get the ransomware in there, their ransomware software takes care of the encryption, then they handle payouts, and then there's like a 10, 20, 30, whatever percentage cut to the affiliate who did the infection and got the payout. And then 60, 70% to the developer because they're the ones handling the ransomware, the payment, the wallets, and all that jazz. Now, the number of ransomware groups targeting organizations in the UAE grew to 19 from 12 in 2023, according to the State of the UAE Cybersecurity Report. Among those groups most active in the region are the Ransom Hub and Lockbit. I have touched on Lockbit before. I don't believe I've touched on Ransom Hub. And then you have a couple players that are no longer around, like AlphaV. They were prevalent in 2023, but because of their takedown, they haven't been active in 2024. That could always change in the future. There could be a resurgence. There could be a copycat. Lockbit did not dominate as much in 2024, but remained the top ransomware family targeting UAE organizations. The source is the UAE Cybersecurity Council and CPX. As long as there's money in these kind of organizations, they're going to keep trying to go after them. The subsection titled Data Centers, check, IoT not so much, IoT being Internet of Things. The attack surface of organizations in the UAE has grown over the past year, with more than 223,000 vulnerable assets exposed to attacks across the region, an increase from 155,000 devices exposed in 2023, according to the annual CDX reports. During 2024, for example, a third of systems exposed had a year-old OpenSSH vulnerability, CVE 2023-38408. And this is where we're seeing a lot of things. If you've ever used something or ever heard of something like Shodan, which lets you go and look for vulnerable devices on the internet. If you've ever heard of a bunch of devices that don't get patched, that's where a lot of the less sophisticated attacks come from. Because if there's a known CVE, there's probably a known proof of concept or a known exploit for it. And if there's known pieces of software that can attack this vulnerability, it's probably on GitHub or GitLab or one of the other Git repos. There's even tools that let you look for CVEs and payloads to test it. That's a thing in the cybersecurity tools. So if you have this piece of a system, a device that's a year old, or that has a vulnerability that's a year old, especially something like OpenSSH, then you're essentially just saying, hey, it's an open door. Because at that point, anyone who can run a tool can most likely get in. And to automate that would be somewhat trivial for someone who has some basic scripting knowledge. Would it be the most efficient? No, but it's doable. And when you talk about stuff that has patches for it and has been known as CVEs and it doesn't get patched, that is a problem that I've brought up on this channel a lot. You need to patch your devices. Even if it's something that you installed years ago, there is guaranteed going to be a vulnerability and you need to patch it. The problem with a lot of these patches that are 1, 2, 3, 4 years old, they do you no good if the system is out there and unpatched. It's just a liability waiting to be discovered. Security by obscurity does not work. We have to go to be more resilient against all kinds of malware. We have to have backups. We have to try to patch our systems, because it doesn't matter if you have the most secure system in the world. If you have that one router in the back of the building that has 20 vulnerabilities that haven't been patched in 5 years, they have a way in. And once you have a way in, there's ways to pivot laterally. Granted, you could have intrusion detection and all this stuff, but there is ways to bypass even that if you're quiet enough. If you try to obfuscate your traffic using SharePoint, as we just talked about, you can use existing traffic to blend in. But guys, this has been just 2 super interesting articles. Try to stay safe out there. I want to thank you for tuning in. This has been your host, Cipherceval, and I will see you in the next one.